Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
Welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Super excited today because I'm doing another episode with Amy Lunardi. How are you doing, Amy?
I'm very good, Chris. We are on a mission. What's our motto, Chris? We're on a mission to be
Australia's most trusted podcast. Property podcast, in fairness. We're not going for the whole industry of podcasts, which would be yeah. Let's just see if we can take over the property market first before we go into self-help and relationships and romance and all the other elements of
I feel like my job is a lot of self-help. I feel like part of my job is being a counsellor as well as a property advisor. But we have had, we've had such a great year this year and, the end of last year as well. And we've had so many new people come and listen to this podcast, whether that was through the Australian Finance podcast or the other parts of the Rask network or just completely new followers. And it's been absolutely amazing. So thank you to everyone who has been listening so far.
You do touch on a good point around the lifestyle impact of property and the decision-making around people's homes and how it affects relationships and how it affects people's well-being and mental health. And absolutely, when we play our part in that as a financial planner in the past, but even as a mortgage broker, we're dealing with people's lives and their big life decisions come around their home and getting security and stability or even just clarity on where someone's going to live. And what we're going to talk about today is actually in that vein. So we've started it off well. We're going to talk about upsizing and downsizing. And this is like absolutely stressful at all stages, even entering the market in your first property. But upsizing and downsizing adds a whole other element to it because usually you've got to sell something, not always, to make the move. And it adds a whole element of complication. So, let's crack into this today, Amy. What do you think the biggest takeaways are going to be for people listening?
Yeah, so let's maybe start with upsizing, although, both of these scenarios involve you already having a property that you're living in. So upsizing is generally when you're wanting to buy a new property because you need more space, whether that is a bigger dwelling, so maybe some more bedrooms and more living space. You're upsizing from an apartment to a townhouse or a townhouse to a house. Or maybe you're considering buying something to grow into in the future, a house to maybe renovate or extend. And in these scenarios, not always, but we're generally talking about spending more money when we're upsizing if we're wanting to stay in a similar location. Although you could also consider upsizing as increasing your property size or your land size, but trying to keep it at the same price and maybe moving further out as well. So it can be various different scenarios. It's not always just getting into a bigger property. But you are going to be in that really tough position of saying, okay, well, how do I approach this? Do I buy or do I sell first? And what are the risks of both options? How do I approach this financially? So there's a lot to unpack in all of this. And this will be a great episode as well because I'm going to have a chat about it on the, the practicality side of things and what to consider when you're, wanting to go through this process. And then Chris, you can have a chat to us about, well, how do you actually finance it and fund it? And what are all of your different various options?
Yeah, I think the decision-making around it is a lot for people to process. When you add in, most time people need to upsize when they've got kids in their agenda, right? And, they're running out of space or, they think that they are going to run out of space as they get bigger. And when you add in that, you add in jobs, you add in just life, and then you add in the complications of having to think through selling, school zones, upgrading, buying, selling first, doing renovations to your current place to get. There's so much for people to deal with. Time and time again, I've seen clients put off that decision. And what happens is it doesn't go away. Sometimes you can't renovate the place that you're in. So that's just not an option. And some point, what ends up happening is they come when it's the pressure cooker and the stress is at the at the top because they really have no space. The kids are sharing bedrooms and, they want their own rooms and they really put it off. And what they do is they go to look to upgrade now and they look at the growth on their current property and what they want to upgrade into, and that gap's just too big. Whereas if they look to do it years before, they potentially could have made it happen if they just didn't have the brain space to prioritize it. And so one of the things that, we do as a business is really challenge someone. I did it on a call an hour ago. Is this really where you want to live long-term? Do you really want to stay in this property and in this suburb? Have you got enough room? Do you need to renovate it? Because a lot of the time people push back and they say, oh, no, we're happy here. Let's go and do some investing. Well, that's a really dangerous thing to sometimes do because, yes, you may go and do some other investing, but then that decision to upgrade comes sooner than you thought. Yeah. And then you maybe have to sell those investments and maybe that property's run faster than your property. And so, not running away from this decision and trying to come up with a solution on how you're going to attack this sooner rather than later is a good option, particularly when, family situations changing, as in you may be having your first child or, incomes might change because, part-time work, or you might want to start a business, or, something might change to your situation, may stop you upgrading. Sometimes it's better to do it sooner rather than later.
That's a really great point. And it's also even, relevant to consider before you buy that first property. So rather than getting stuck in a property where you do want to upsize, but you might not be in a financial position to do so, maybe consider before you buy that first home how long you're going to be able to live in that property for. I know that this is incredibly hard to predict the future because things change so quickly. You might, find someone and then all of a sudden have a double income, or you might split up, or you might have kids sooner than you expect, or not be able to have kids. But the most important thing is at least putting some kind of consideration into it and saying, okay, if we're buying this property now, how long do we think, or how long do I think I can live here for, or what's the plan? And then beyond that, if I do think that this is what we call like a stepping stone property, so you're just wanting to get into the market, and then you think it's maybe, a 3-4 year property, well, how will that look when you do want to upsize? How, especially if you're thinking that the next property is going to be a more expensive property? Well, how are you going to be able to afford that? Do you plan on your income increasing? Are you going to aggressively pay down your mortgage? How are you going to be able to finance that upgrade? You might not have that answer now, but it's worth considering, because sometimes people will buy their first property and say, well, I'm just going to let that grow in value and that's the way that I'm going to upgrade. Well, there's still going to be a gap, isn't there? If you're just, say, buying and selling in the same market and your $500,000 property grows at 5%, but then you're upgrading to an $800,000 property and that's also been growing at 5%, what's creating a bigger gap for you. And then you've also got to factor in the buying and selling costs, stamp duty, agent fees, all of these extra things. How are you going to be able to finance all of that later on? Just having a think about that now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a common thing. Someone who hasn't got a property and they're trying to enter the market for the first time is really, what is your strategy? And if it is sort of buying it to live in it for a short runway, and then you've got to pay stamp duty, selling costs. Maybe you don't pay stamp duty because it's a first home buyer exemption, which does make it a bit better. Or maybe you get it, that's all you can afford because of your borrowing capacity and because of your deposit. And, maybe that's better than doing nothing. But if you have got the capacity and you have got the cash and you can potentially buy something that gives you a bigger runway and then releases that pressure in the pressure cooker a little bit and allows you to, get in there, add some value. The growth on that hopefully is, a bit better than, some of the stepping stone properties a lot of first home buyers have to buy. If you look back in time, a lot of the housing markets outperform the unit market. And so usually people buy the unit market for the first property, but they want to upgrade into the housing market. And, like you said, maybe it grew 5% in the apartment, but maybe it grew 7% in the house. And that's one of the challenges we see when people delay the upgrade is they go, no, this suits us now. We love being around the city. We love being near the water. We just need a 2-bed. We'll upgrade when we need to. And what we're just sort of highlighting is sometimes there's an opportunity cost of waiting till you need to. And also when you need to is usually sometimes the most stressful time because, the kids are there and, even just this morning I was chatting to a client. He's a really close friend, and up on the Central Coast, and they're moving from a smaller sort of cottage style house on a small block, and they want to move into a house that's like a renovator up on the Central Coast. And they were going to do this thing last week. They had the property they found, and the agent said, "Oh, hang on a sec, maybe you want to sell your property first." They've sold their property, and now they're looking to upgrade. And so, I think it's a really big chat. So why don't we crack on into it? Do you think that how do you approach if someone comes to you, Amy, they're saying, "Look, I want to upgrade." What's some of the first things you try to consider with them?
Yeah, so quite often, well, first of all, we'll do our normal property homework. So when we're doing our homework, we're saying, okay, well, what does this next property look like? We've got to create our property brief, which is really part of the overall strategy. The strategy is the why, the when, the what, and the how. And that leads us to then saying, okay, well, as part of that strategy, this is my budget for the new property. This is where we want to live. This is the size we need, the condition, etc. So doing all of that homework to say, okay, well, first of all, just because this is what you want, is it actually realistic? Is it achievable with your budget? And going through all of that, because you don't want to get to a point where maybe you've gone and sold your property and then you can't actually buy or afford what you want, or it doesn't really exist. So a lot of homework up front before we're getting to the point of like timeframes or decisions. So that process can take a while. Sometimes I'll give clients homework and I don't hear from them for 6 months because it takes them that amount of time to actually figure out what they really want. But then once they get to the point where they say, okay, well, this is our property brief and this is realistic and achievable because we've been able to demonstrate that through, finding relevant sold properties, then we can really like nut out that decision of whether they buy or whether they sell first. Because this is one of the more complicated things. Once you're once you've bought a property, there's less flexibility than if you're renting or if you're living at home, because you've got to then finance that new property. You might have like a gap between settlements that you have to deal with as well. So when we're making the decision around selling or buying first, it's not black and white. There's so many things that we need to consider. So Chris, as part of like figuring out all of this property brief, one of the key elements is your budget. And this is where you have to sit down with a mortgage broker to be able to figure out how much you might be able to spend, because you don't know how much you're going to sell for. So in these situations, what kind of questions are you asking around, anticipated sale prices and, worst case, best case scenarios? Like, how do you actually then advise a client on, well, this is how much you can go and spend later on, so they can do this homework?
Look, we've done lots of work with upgraders over the years, and it is a really emotional time, which we've spoken about. But what we try to do is give real clarity and certainty on what they can and can't do if they do sell and they want to upgrade. And there's 3 real options. 1, what could we buy if we sell? What could we buy if we use a bridging loan? And then what can we buy at if we don't sell, right? And, it's very uncommon nowadays, to be honest, where people can upgrade and spend much more than what they currently got and afford to keep their current properties. Borrowing capacity is just really, really tight. But it's absolutely, if you can do it, it's a great outcome because you can upgrade without the need to sell your place. So if it makes sense to sell, then you sell. If not, sometimes people say, well, I'm going to hold it for a few more years and get growth on that property and then sell that in a few years and then pay off my new home. So you can make a decision, or I'll just sell that in 6 months' time in spring rather than, selling it now. And if I get a lowball offer, that's fine. I can just, wait for the right offer. That's a great place to be, but not many people can upgrade without selling. The bridging option, there are some really non-bank lenders. There are options there where you can get a payday sort of finance to bridge a gap between a purchase and the sale. But there's usually an application fee that is, 1% to 2%. And that really means that option's not a great option unless you're, it really is the difference between buying or not buying. And so we don't really recommend that. There are bridging options that are done through the big banks, but just in terms of the way they do their calculations and the way they buffer it and how tight borrowing capacity is, very few clients can use a bridging loan to upgrade unless they've got extensive equity and very low debt usually that allows them to have that equity and very strong servicing. So they're upgrading, but they're upgrading from a position of power, lots of equity and really strong borrowing capacity. And a lot of people are upgrading in that position. So most people are really what we're trying to figure out is that if you do sell, assuming that property's settled, not just sold, it has to have settled, what's the maximum a bank would lend you? And some banks will give you pre-approval, even though you haven't sold, on the proviso that that loan will that you have sold. And so you don't have to sell to get pre-approval. Some banks will give it to you prior. And so what we do is we figure out exactly what that number is. So based on your current income, assuming you don't hold any properties and your current liabilities and your family situation, etc., what's the maximum you can borrow? And then what we figure out is, well, what's maximum cash? What's the likely cash amount you're going to have on top of that? Assuming a bad day sale price on your current property, less the agent's fees, less any sunk costs in selling. And, then you can sort of figure out, well, if we sell for X on a bad day, plus what we can borrow from a bank, this is roughly what we can spend after we minus off stamp duty. We have a bit for a buffer. We might have to pay a buyer's agent. And so then, like when you're saying, Amy, the client in their mind goes, okay, well, I can spend 1.2 million, for example, but that doesn't mean they just rush out and sell. What they really need to do is check if that's achievable as per your first point.
Now, Chris, bridging finance, I think is often quite confusing to people, but it's really great if you can get it because it provides you with so much more flexibility going through this process. Just for anyone listening to this who has never heard of it or thinks, well, this could be an option for me. What does bridging finance actually mean? Do all lenders offer it? What kind of people are eligible for it? And what are the kind of benefits and risks around it?
Look, I mean, the benefit is that you can settle the sale of your property after the settlement date on your purchase, right? And so you've got this gap. You've purchased a new property, you've potentially moved into the new property, but your current property still hasn't, it may have sold, but it hasn't settled, or it may have not have sold, right? And I think that allows you to potentially be in the marketplace, be able to purchase, be able to move into the new place, then move out of your current place, either try to sell it after you've purchased, so you don't have to get out of the market and be out of the market and then have nowhere to live, for example. So you can still live in your current place. But one of the biggest benefits of bridging is actually you can take your time with the purchase. You finally secure your property. You can be very flexible with the settlement terms with the seller because you don't have to sell your place. So you can act fast if you need to. You move into your place. You move out of your old place. You tidy it up and then you style it and you do a proper campaign and you sell it at the best time of year, right? Which sometimes that option's when you buy and you're trying to buy and sell at the same time, you don't have all that flexibility unless you can either buy without selling or you've got access to a bridging finance. Now, what is it? Some banks, the Big Four, for example, will offer a type of relocation loan, they call it. But in terms of the way they look at your assessment and the haircuts, to be honest, in this tight borrowing capacity, not many people are eligible for that. We absolutely will do the numbers and check what you can do, but often it's not enough to allow people to make enough jump. Yeah, they can get more money than what they're currently got, but that's not enough to go from the apartment to the house or the smaller house to the bigger house, which is what they want to do. There are some second tier lenders and non-banks which you can go, but A, the interest rates are much higher. B, they usually charge something like an application fee because they know they're only going to make money off you for a really short period of time because it's between two settlements, which might be 2 days to 2 months to 2 weeks. So they're not going to make much money interest because it's only a short period.
Yeah, it's not very lucrative for them, is it?
But what they do charge is an application fee. That might be 1% to 2% times your loan amount. So if it's a $1 million loan that they're going to have to bridge for 6 weeks, well, you might pay 20 grand plus a higher interest rate for 6 weeks. And you might have to factor in whether that's actually worth it for you. But often you can't even do that because of the way the loan's set up. So definitely you need some really good advice if you're considering bridging, but usually you try to avoid it unless you have to.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why at the very beginning, before you start this whole process, you sit down with a broker Or maybe if your broker can't help you with the bridging finance, you do approach the lender you're currently with just to understand your options, because yes, it provides you with a lot more flexibility, which for some people is more important than the monetary cost. However, it can be quite costly. And in the interim, whilst you've got these two loans, you're paying interest on both properties. You're paying interest only though on the bridging loan. Is that correct, Chris?
So it depends. In this situation, you're probably paying bridging on the gap often between the current loan that you're taking out with the bank, and then the bridging portion would be at a higher interest rate. So,
yep.
But it depends. If you do it, that's if you're doing it through like a non-bank. But if you're doing it through a big four, usually what you're paying is on the peak debt. So you're not just paying on your current property plus all the debt you've used to buy the next property.
Yeah. Yep. So there you go. Flexibility, it comes with cost, pros and cons, but I think that it's a great idea to explore, because you also don't want to be in a position later on if you can, if you find yourself in a position where you have to sell under duress or you've mistimed things. It's just good to have a backup plan, because if you put yourself in a position where you can't align those settlements, and then you have to sell for a price you're really, really, really disappointed with, that can be incredibly stressful as well. So let's focus on the situation of like what kind of situations are better to buy first rather than selling. And one of the key benefits of buying before you sell is you just have a lower risk of needing short-term accommodation. And that is because it generally takes a lot longer to buy, and this is a generalization, generally takes a lot longer to buy than it does to sell, because you've got to go out there looking for properties. There's no guarantee something's going to come up. You might miss out on a few properties. So, on average, it takes my clients around 6 to 8 weeks to buy. But I would say that, if you're not working with a buyer's advocate, it could be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, much longer, depending on what you're looking for. So this is an especially like a better strategy to buy first is if what you're looking for is possibly quite scarce or rare, or you're in a really competitive market, and all the more reason it might take you longer. Because once you've bought, it's generally, not in all cases, but it's generally much quicker to then go and sell your property as well. So especially if the market is increasing in value at that point in time, this could be a much better option to buy first, because you're locking in that purchase price. And then if the market is going up, well, then you've bought for a lower price than you're going to sell for later. Now, that is a really hard thing to plan ahead for, because as you know, Chris, things change quite often in the property market. Things go up and down and sideways, and sometimes it can be hard for you to know what's going on. But yes, as a general rule of thumb, if the market is increasing, buying first is generally a better idea. But in this situation, if you're buying a property first, you don't know how much you're going to be selling for. This is one of the biggest question marks, because you can go out and get, a couple of agents through your property. They can give you appraisals, but that's their opinion. They don't know how much it's going to sell for. And I've sometimes seen agents just go in way too high because they're trying to overpromise to win the business, or maybe sometimes they're too conservative. And because you don't know what your property is going to sell for, if you underestimate how much it's going to sell for, then it means maybe you could have bought something better because property sells for more later. But if you overestimate, that's more dangerous, isn't it? Because then you're relying on money that you might not actually have later. So that is a big risk. And that's where you do tend to need to be more conservative when you're speaking to your broker around, what your options could be based on worst case scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's assume that someone can't buy without selling their current home. So they have to sell and they can't get bridging. It's just, they haven't got enough capacity and enough equity. So they have to sell, but they're figuring out, do I sell first, get out of the market, maybe find some rental accommodation? The market's going up. So then potentially they start getting nervous, they freak out. And often why we don't like that strategy is because someone goes into a rental, they live with family, and they just get buyer fatigue and they end up rushing the decision to buy and the upgrade. And they often go from one frying pan to another. And they end up, because the market's moving, they thought they could get into X suburb, but now they can't. They have to go into Y suburb. But they thought they could get a house and they're getting a townhouse. And they at the end of it, they go, did we really, for all the stamp duty, the selling costs, really get what we want, or did we rush it? And because of buying a property is emotional, often we see that that's one of the risks of selling first, is you're out of the market and you start making bad decisions. Whereas you can buy first, you're like, no, we're in the market, we've got time. But one of the challenges buying first is that you need to buy on a longer settlement. And, we advise clients trying to get at least 4 months, ideally 5 or 6 months settlements, because that means that once they do buy, they've got 6 months to get their property ready for sale, get it on the market, get it sold, and then get it settled before they need to settle on the purchase. And often when you're in a competitive market and you're looking for a property, a lot of sellers can do 4, 5, 6 months. You'd be surprised. A lot of people think no seller would ever do 4 months. But often a lot of sellers are trying to get back into the market as well. They're just trying to sell first. They don't have the guts to try to buy first. Often there's a deceased estate, or there's no rush on the money coming through. So if you're offering the most money, they're happy to wait. But sometimes sellers need the money fast. They need a 30-day settlement. They need a 6-week settlement. And when you're upgrading, you're trying to buy before selling, you just can't offer that unless you can access things like bridging finance, etc. So that's one of the negatives of buying first is sometimes you just can't buy the property you fall in love with because the vendor can't do a long enough settlement period. Another reason why, besides that, is we potentially ask a client to sell first is there's just not certainty around the sale price. It's not a great property. It's not in a great location. There's something flawed about it. The market's not great. Money is tight. And if they don't sell it or it takes too long, we've seen a lot of issues with people buying, high density apartments, and they want to sell from that into a house. And, it's just too risky trying to buy on a long settlement and trying to sell the apartment fast because there's lots of them and they're just not sure if they're going to A, be able to find a buyer, or B, get anywhere near, even on a bad day price. And often in those situations, they'd love to buy first, but it just makes more sense to sell first. We've had lots of clients who have put a bad day price on the sale though, and they end up getting a good day price and more. And even this client last week where in the Central Coast is they thought they would sell, low 1 million. They end up selling about 100 grand more than that they expected. And so then that gave them even more confidence to go and upgrade and stretch into the next property. And so, the buy versus sell thing is something to really think through. Don't just rush and go, like, I need to know your sale price, because sometimes you have a pretty good idea based on a number of sales locally that it's going to sell, particularly if you go to the open homes, you see how busy they are, you go to an auction, similar property to you're in the marketplace, not just listening to what agents say, because Amy's hit the nail on the head. You got to take that with a big grain of salt, but your own personal eyes seeing competition at open homes and going to auctions, I don't think nothing gives you more confidence that, particularly if it's a property like your property. And that gives you confidence that when you do buy, you sign that contract and it's a 5-month settlement, you go, well, I'm really confident I'm going to be able to sell my property within a month for a decent price without rushing it. And that would still give a buyer up to a 4-month settlement, because if you sign a contract for a 2 or a 3-month settlement, then that means you can only accept buyers that can, that can transact really fast, and you can rule out a lot of buyers who need a 3 or 4 month settlement for some reason as well. So, it's a case by case basis, but often if you've got a decent asset, it makes sense to potentially buy before selling. But you've got to really play the game right and make sure you don't put too much pressure on yourself and too short of a settlement, or leave you too dry, which is what your point was there, Amy. You're over expecting what you're going to sell for.
Yeah, in the same way as when you go and buy a property, you've got to put this time and research in yourself. Don't rely on the real estate agent telling you, because just remember, I'm pro agent and everything, but they're wanting to win your business. So sometimes they'll just tell you what you want to hear, but you do need to understand the liquidity of the market that you're selling in, the market, broader market itself, which is, a couple of years ago, when 2019, when the election was looming, no one was buying property at that time. It was taking ages to sell things, or you had to take massive discounts. But then understanding the market for your particular property. Are you in a regional town where it just takes a lot longer to sell properties and a lot of buyers are subject to finance? Therefore, maybe you have to take the property off the market for 2 weeks, and then the finance falls through and you have to put it back on again. Or is your property particularly scarce, like in a not so good way, like it's really unique, or maybe it's got odd zoning, which could just mean it takes a really long time to sell, or there's just 20 of the same type of properties on the market at one time, which, like you said, Chris, can happen in high-rise apartments. So in which case, because there is a risk of taking such a long time to sell, you need to say, okay, well, maybe I need to do that first, because if I go and buy first, I'm going to be under so much pressure to sell, even if I've got a longer settlement. In Melbourne here in the current market, I would say it's not very easy to find vendors who will take longer than 4 months.
Mm.
On average, we're finding, 30, 60, 90. Sometimes you can push it out and you might say, okay, well, I'm just going to try this first, where I try and go and buy something, see what's out there, try and buy on a much longer settlement. But you might get to a stage where you say, well, this is not working for me.
Yeah.
Because I just can't find the properties that have the longer settlements, and therefore you just might not have a choice. You'll need to go and sell first. But yeah, don't underestimate the time it takes to sell too. If you go and buy, like you said, Chris, minimum 120 days is ideally what you'd be wanting to buy on, to then go sell your property, because you've got to get it online. If you're going to auction, that's a 3.5, 4 week campaign. But then don't forget, you want to offer your buyer flexible settlement terms, 30, 60, 90, to have as many buyers involved as possible. If all of a sudden you've put yourself in a position where you can only offer a 30 or 45-day settlement, you're going to restrict the amount of people that can buy a property. And it just means that if you've then got no one interested or less competition, you might have to take significantly less. So yeah, there are a lot of risks around buying first, primarily that lack of knowing what you're going to sell for, and then just putting yourself in a position of pressure if all of a sudden you then have to go and sell, and it's just much harder to sell than you anticipate.
Yeah, I think I've seen over the years as well, people really want to know, right? People love certainty. They love knowing that I'm not going to ever buy first because I don't know what I'm going to sell for. And sometimes that's a self-limiting belief, I would say, because does it really matter? Sometimes it matters absolutely that you get that extra 10,000 or 50,000. And, you wouldn't have sold it if you didn't get that, and you couldn't upgrade if you didn't get that price. But often it wouldn't affect things. You could still do that upgrade. Yeah, it would be nice to get that price that you hoped for. But, sometimes the benefit is entering the market now and getting a good asset versus potentially selling in 12 months' time. Yeah, you got a better sale price, but you end up paying more for the next property. And so sometimes you got to focus on the long-term win and the benefit to you as your family to have that certainty. And that's often what we see, is that you feel much more comfortable and happy as a unit when you know that this is where you're going to be long-term. You can make better investments in your relationships, in your community and your neighbor, and you haven't got this thing that constantly pops up in the back of your mind is, yeah, we're here, but we're not here forever. And that sort of, I do think that provides a lot of stress for families. And so doing that decision earlier, I think there's lots of benefits. And, sometimes people hold on to a property. I'm not going to sell it till it hits a certain price. Well, yeah, you get that price, but what was the opportunity cost? And so, yeah, just be really careful whether that sale price really matters as much as you think it does. People love getting a price for the ego of it, but does it really make sense financially?
Yeah. So selling first, like you said, more certainty around that sale price, but also, maybe don't just think of a number and say, I'm not going to sell until I get exactly that. It'd be a little bit more flexible. You'll also have more certainty around your time frames as well. If you sell first, you say, okay, well, I've sold and this is the settlement I'm working towards. Now, what are my options? Do I go find a rental? Do I go and get an Airbnb, or do I, do I stay with family? Because in this situation where you sell first, there is just a much higher risk of needing short-term alternative accommodation elsewhere. And, you can go and enter the rental market. That does give you the ultimate flexibility because you can go and break a lease. Yes, it is a bit annoying to break a lease, but it means that you're not going to be paying an exorbitant amount for an Airbnb. And it just gives you that extra time to buy. But you just then need to be a bit careful there, because if the market is changing or it's increasing, you need to get your skates on and to say, okay, well, now we've actively got to go and buy something. You don't want to then get left behind if the market starts to increase and get away from you. So where selling first makes much more sense is if the market is decreasing. This could be a much better option because you sell for a higher price and then you buy for a lower price later on. But regardless of what the market is doing, you need to be proactive and go and get out there as soon as possible, because the best advice, which I'm sure Chris agrees with, is ideally you just try and buy and sell in the same market. So as close together as you can, regardless of what the market is doing, just to avoid getting left behind. And again, selling first is a better option if your house might take a while to sell to get that certainty. And in many situations, you just might not have a choice. You have to sell first from a finance perspective, and you can't find anywhere that is offering you longer settlements. So you just have to sell first and then try and buy as quick as you can, knowing that you can rent elsewhere or stay with family and friends.
Yeah, it's often not a great outcome where we've seen clients try to get out of the market and they look to buy in the market and they just don't meet the market because the market's moving on them. And so they're out of the market, they've got the cash in the bank, they're pre-approved, they could buy, but they start to get buyer fatigue, they get exhausted, they don't want to pay what the market is costing to enter because they thought they had to spend 1.7 and now it's 1.8 or 1.9, and maybe they don't make these compromises. They don't make the compromises because they say, well, I can't live in this suburb, but I want to live in Sydney, for example, wherever it might be. They sit their money in bank, they rent something, and then the years go by and they don't re-enter because it's just too painful. I can think of countless examples I've seen over the years where people have got out, or they've got out with the ideas as, 2018 prices are going to fall, even 2020, even last year. There's people who, do sort of try to time markets and they get a little bit too picky, and it's really hard in property markets. I would say it's easier in equity markets to enter because you can enter in minutes and seconds rather than the property markets take time. And when prices fall, liquidity dries up, and it's really hard to time down markets. And usually you get surprises. You would have thought prices were as resilient as they were in the last 2 years with interest rates going up like they have. So should we have a quick chat about downsizers? We are running low on time. Should we have a quick chat at the end?
Yeah, so downsizing, well, a lot of the considerations we've already spoken about are still going to be relevant for downsizing too, because what we're talking about is still buying and selling and having to make that decision on what's, the right thing to do for you. But generally downsizing, we're talking about a smaller property or smaller land. We're talking about someone who maybe has, raised their children in this big 4 or 5 bedroom home, and now it's just too big for them. It's got stairs or it needs too much maintenance. So we're talking about mostly downsizing the size of that property. And in some cases, but not all cases, a cheaper property. So, but I've seen plenty of downsizers who, for whatever reason, they don't want to actually spend less, or they don't need to spend less. They want to maybe get into a better location. So even though it's a smaller property, it's a better property. It's a newer property, or it's in a more premium area. But other times they might be in a position where financially they do need to downsize because they're reliant on a portion of that sale price to go towards funding their retirement. So in these cases, considering if you're not already working with a financial planner, to understand what this is going to look like and how it's going to impact, the next couple of decades of your life, understanding understanding, the eligibility for downsizer contributions, so speaking to the ATO or speaking to a financial planner, but also understanding how you're going to be able to finance the next sale, because maybe if you are getting close to retirement or you are retired, you don't have an income. So Chris, when you're talking to downsizers who have a lower income than they used to, or maybe no income at all, how do you then approach this conversation around going to buy another property? Because I presume that they're not necessarily going to be eligible for bridging and therefore might not have a choice.
Yeah, it's really surprising. There's a lot of myths around lending for people over the age of 50, 55, 60, people who are retired. Andrew and our team is actually specializing in that space. And, it's really surprising. Sometimes you can get borrowing. You can get borrowing on your super when you're retired, etc. So definitely if you're at that point, don't just assume what you think a bank would do is what they'll actually do. Even we did some research a couple of years ago because we're getting consulted on a new product entering the market. And I was surprised with what some of the banks would do. I actually didn't know they would do it. And so, if you are at that stage, definitely still speak to a broker. And there's lots of things you can do even if you're not working, like deposit bonds. If you haven't got the cash for a deposit, there's ways to get bridging, more often than not in this space. It's possible. But yeah, that downsizing thing, I do think speaking to a financial planner was a good shout there, Amy. There are rules around putting more money into super. And, you are at a point in time where maybe a nicer home doesn't matter as much, and maybe cash flow and liquidity is a better decision, and getting an equity return is more important than maybe having a nicer place. When you're younger and you can get capital growth and you've got a good asset growing for you tax-free, having access to cash in super is not that important, right? Or having liquidity, because you've got an income. But at later years in life, you don't really want to downsize and then have to downsize again because you run out of money. You want to make sure you've got enough money to last. And sometimes just having, and just being strategic on that downsize, and also giving money to kids. That's definitely something we're seeing at the moment. We don't want to talk about this for 20 minutes, but we're seeing people downsizing and they are freeing up a bunch of cash because they're getting out of the housing market and they're getting into, a townhouse or a bigger apartment. And then they're giving that money away to their kids at this stage as well, because their equity portfolio and their super and their house is selling for more than they expected, and etc. So yeah, downsizing, they do need some good advice, and a great financial planner can help them figure out what's the pros and cons of spending X versus Y.
And I do find that downsizers, this is going to be a generalization, of course, but I do find that they tend to take a little bit longer in this whole process, because in many situations, they're not necessarily in a rush, but it also takes a while for them to wrap their head around saying, okay, well, I've been in this property for 10, 20, 30, 40 longer years. I've raised my children here. It's a very emotional process. It can often take quite a bit of time for that house to be prepared, to get rid of all of the clutter, because all the stuff's not going to fit in the new property. There's often a lot of other opinions involved as well, because especially with older downsizers who have multiple children, maybe they've all got a different opinion on where mum or dad or both want to live or need to live. And, there's a lot of family disputes that I've seen in the past with all of this.
For sure.
But for all this reason, it can take a lot longer. And quite often downsizers also have these extra requirements, like, a property that doesn't need any maintenance, so it's already renovated. Single level is often really important for a downsizer. I see a lot of them wanting a garage as well, or a double garage. And especially if they're then looking to buy into a market which is really popular with downsizers, they need to understand that those single level properties can be super competitive. In Melbourne, for example, in areas like Boroondara, Hawthorn and Kew, where we do have a lot of, older, more wealthy people, and over, Moonee Valley, Moonee Ponds, Essendon, etc., those single level properties are very, very competitive. So, factoring that in to understand this process is going to take potentially a lot more time, a lot more emotions. Maybe you need to consider financial power of attorneys, etc. So I think it's in this situation, having that that team around you, like that financial planner, having a broker as well, understanding all of your options is even more important. For example, Chris, you talked about earlier deposit bonds. Not all agents, and very few agents I come across, will accept a deposit bond. So they might need to find some cash in the short term to pay the deposit until their property settles. So yeah, same considerations as we talked about earlier, but just understanding if the goal is to buy first, that might be a better option because it can take a longer time to find what you want, having to finance that purchase as well. Those conversations could take a while. But as long as they've also then just probably put in a lot of prep work into getting that property ready to sell as well, so that they don't then buy and all of a sudden they've got this overwhelming task of decluttering this home they've been in for a really long time and then having to sell really quickly. I will touch on, something called vendor advocacy too, which is where a property advocate such as myself gets involved to help that vendor sell. So help them choose an agent, value that property, prepare that property for sale. And I do tend to get a lot of my vendor advocacy clients who are a little bit older and they just lack that confidence around, well, where do I start? How do I decide which agent is best? I've got so many opinions. I just need that independent person to help, or maybe they have no family support to help them through that process. So I do tend to find a lot of my clients for vendor advocacy do tend to be to downsizers for those reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's lots to learn with vendor advocacy and downsizing. It's like a window with upgrading. Often people that it's too stressful thinking about it, getting rid of all the stuff, the family members, where are the kids going to come for Christmas? All these sort of questions come in. And if they don't get downsized at that point, it's called the golden years where they really value and they want to travel and they miss that, then they think actually it's all too stressful and they stay. And that's one of the real problems in our property market is that people don't downsize and it doesn't free up housing supply for the next generations because people don't want to downsize. They don't want to leave the home. Why should they, to be honest? They've lived there for 30, 40 years. It's not our right to say that. But they also don't have an option. There's very limited, like you say, a lot of competition for what they want. There's not many apartments that are big enough that suits the grandkids coming and where they want to live. They want to stay in their suburb, and you do a whole other episode on downsizing. So, Amy, great chat today, and hope our listeners got lots of value in it. If they want to chat to you, Amy, obviously there's a link in the show notes. The same for me, and I really enjoyed chatting today.
Thanks, Chris. I'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.